There is a moment in the historical record that stops you cold. A samurai, stripped of his swords, kneeling in the dirt of a castle compound while the torches burn in the dark around him. He is not dead, not yet. What happens next depends on a calculation that has very little to do with the mythologized idea of the noble warrior caste, and everything to do with the mechanics of feudal power, loyalty, obligation, and institutional control. This is not a story about spiritual enlightenment or ancient warrior codes as later romanticized texts describe them. This is a story about what happens when a fighting man, within a rigid hierarchy, breaks the rules that hold that hierarchy together, and who decides what those rules were, who had the authority to enforce them, and what enforcement actually looked like in practice. The thumbnail you clicked on is honest in one way. The power imbalance it shows, one man armed, standing over another man on the ground, that image captures something real about feudal Japan. Not because every disciplinary act looked like a midnight confrontation with torches. Most didn't. But that gap between the man who held authority and the man who had violated it was the organizing principle of samurai life, and the consequences of crossing it were far more varied, far more institutional, and far more methodical than popular imagination tends to suggest. To understand what samurai did to warriors who broke the rules, you first have to understand what the rules actually were, who made them, and what they were designed to protect. The answer to that last question is the key to everything else. Feudal Japan, across the roughly 7 centuries during which the samurai class held real military and political power, from the Kamakura period in the late 12th century through to the dissolution of the class system in the Meiji era of the late 19th century, was organized around loyalty relationships between warriors and their lords. A samurai served a master. That master might serve a higher lord, who in turn answered to someone above him. The chain of obligation was what kept the military order functioning, and what held that chain together was not philosophy, it was enforcement. The rules that governed samurai conduct were not always written down in formal codes, particularly in the earlier periods. They were embedded in custom, in precedent, in the expectations of the lord, and in the social pressure of living and fighting alongside other warriors who watched your behavior closely. In the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, when actual warfare was frequent and military service was the defining purpose of the samurai class, the rules were largely practical. You showed up when called. You fought. You did not flee the field without permission. You did not betray your lord to his enemies. You did not steal from the lord's resources or undermine his authority. These were not abstract moral precepts. They were the conditions under which the entire military system could function. Later, particularly in the relatively peaceful centuries of the Edo period under Tokugawa rule, the rules became more elaborate, more formalized, and in some ways more suffocating. The samurai of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries were often administrators as much as warriors, carrying swords they rarely needed to draw, serving lords through paperwork and ceremony and the performance of status. But the fundamental structure of obligation and obedience remained, and the consequences for violating it, if anything, became more carefully codified. What counted as breaking the rules? The violations ranged enormously in severity, and the response varied accordingly. At the lower end sat infractions that might be handled through reprimand, dock and stipend, or public humiliation within the domain. A samurai who arrived drunk to a duty assignment, who neglected the maintenance of his equipment, who insulted a superior carelessly, or failed to follow the correct protocol in the presence of a lord. These were men who had erred, but not catastrophically. Their violations reflected on their competence, their discipline, their judgment. The response was calibrated to correct behavior and restore order without destroying a man who was still useful. In the context of a military campaign, small failures of discipline had a sharper edge. On the road, in camp, in the days before or after a battle, the pressure of collective safety made individual sloppiness dangerous. A man who slept on watch compromised everyone around him. A man who broke formation without orders created confusion that could cascade. A man who looted beyond what was permitted, and there were, in many campaigns, understood boundaries around what could be taken from what and from whom, undermined the lord's relationship with the population he depended on for supply and intelligence.
Surviving accounts from campaigns in the Sengoku period, the century of almost continuous warfare preceding Tokugawa unification, described lords issuing explicit regulations before campaigns that covered behavior in the field in considerable detail. Violations were handled by officers on the spot or referred up the chain depending on severity. What you need to visualize here is not a mystical judgment carried out beneath cherry blossoms. You need to visualize a camp in the gray early morning, mist off a river, horses restless in their lines, men wrapped in whatever they had against the cold, eating rice from wooden bowls if they were lucky. The samurai who commanded them carried authority not through philosophical elevation, but through proximity to the Lord's power and through the practical capacity to enforce decisions. Discipline in the field was often quick and blunt. A minor infraction might earn a man a beating administered by his immediate superiors. The physical correction of lower status fighters by their commanders was not considered unusual. It was part of the texture of military life, unpleasant and unremarkable in the way that fatigue and mud and bad food were unremarkable.
More serious violations required more formal handling. Desertion, leaving the field without permission, was among the gravest military offenses. In a period when a battle's outcome could hinge on the number of men holding a position, a warrior who broke and ran was not simply a coward. He was a man who had potentially destroyed the Lord's tactical situation, exposed other fighters to greater danger, and violated the most fundamental obligation of military service. The consequences for proven desertion could be severe and public. Execution was possible. Exile was another option, the stripping of status and removal from the domain. In cases where the desertion had contributed to a significant military defeat, surviving records suggest the response could be harsh and swift. Betrayal occupied a category of its own. A samurai who provided information to an enemy, who secretly negotiated with a rival lord, who worked to undermine his master's position while still accepting his rice stipend and the protection of his status. This was not simply rule-breaking. This was a fundamental collapse of the loyalty bond that the entire system depended on. The punishments for confirmed betrayal were often total and could extend beyond the individual. In some documented cases, the families of traitors were implicated and punished alongside them. The logic was structural. If loyalty was owed not just by the individual, but by his household, then betrayal implicated the household. This was not justice in any modern sense. It was the feudal system protecting itself with the tools available to it. The authority to punish rested with the Lord. This is a point that cannot be overstated because it distinguishes the actual historical system from later romanticized versions of samurai discipline. The image of the samurai as a man who policed himself according to an internalized code of honor, correcting his own failures through austere self-denial or ritualized death, contains some truth but obscures the institutional reality. Punishment was, in most cases, something that happened to a samurai, something decided and carried out by those above him in the hierarchy, not something he administered to himself in a spirit of transcendent warrior wisdom. The Lord held the power of patronage and the power of destruction. A samurai without a lord was a ronin, literally a wave man, unattached and drifting, without stipend, without standing, without the protections and obligations of service. The threat of dismissal was constant and real. To be removed from service was to lose everything that defined your position in that society: your income, your household security, your rank, your place in the ceremonies and duties that structured daily life. For a man with a family, with subordinates who depended on him, with debts and obligations extending in every direction, the loss of Lord's favor was catastrophic, even without any physical punishment attached to it. Lords used this power deliberately. A warrior who performed poorly, who caused embarrassment, who created problems within the domain's administration or military structure, might find himself gradually marginalized, given less responsibility, excluded from the Lord's presence, passed over in assignments. The social pressure of that marginalization was itself a form of punishment, and a sensitive one. In a world where status was performance and your standing was visible every day in where you sat, what you were assigned, who spoke to you, and how,
Being quietly demoted in the Lord's estimation was a punishment that operated continuously, invisibly, without any dramatic confrontation. When lords did act formally and publicly, the range of punishments available was considerable. At the administrative end, a warrior might have his stipend reduced, a practical blow that affected his household's day-to-day survival. He might be placed under house arrest, confined to his residence for a defined period, effectively removed from social circulation. He might be ordered to shave his head and enter a temple, a form of forced semi-retirement that carried significant social stigma. In domains with formal legal structures, particularly under Tokugawa administration, violations could be adjudicated through processes that had some resemblance to legal proceedings, with witnesses, documentation, and set penalties according to the severity of the offense. Exile took several forms. Banishment from the domain removed the offending warrior from the lord's territory entirely, ending his service and his household standing there. In more severe cases, exile could mean banishment to remote or uncomfortable locations, the frontier islands, the cold northern regions, places with harsh conditions and little of the social texture that structured the everyday life of a samurai in a settled domain. These destinations were not merely symbolic. They were places where the physical discomfort was real: limited food, inadequate shelter, isolation from the networks of obligation and relationship that had structured every day of a samurai's life in a settled domain. Execution was reserved for the most serious violations. When it came, it was usually not spontaneous. There was almost always a deliberate process, a decision made by the lord or his senior administrators, a formal judgment, a setting. The method could signal the offense and the offender's status. Beheading by sword was standard, but the circumstances around it varied considerably. Whether the execution was public or private, whether the body was treated respectfully or subjected to further degradation, whether the man's household was punished alongside him, these details were all within the Lord's discretionary power, and they communicated to everyone watching what kind of violation had occurred and how seriously the Lord viewed it.
The question of seppuku, the ritual suicide by self-disembowelment that has become the most iconic image associated with samurai punishment, requires careful handling, because the popular image is significantly distorted from the historical reality. Seppuku was real, it was practiced, but it was not a universal constant, not a response to every failure, and not primarily an act of spontaneous spiritual self-correction. In many cases, it was an institutional option, a privilege offered to a samurai of sufficient rank rather than an execution carried out by someone else. It allowed a man to die by his own hand, which was considered a form of dying with status intact, rather than being killed as a common criminal. In the Edo period particularly, when the Tokugawa government increasingly formalized procedures around all aspects of samurai life, seppuku became codified as the prescribed mode of death for samurai found guilty of serious violations, not something a man chose freely, but something that was ordered as the form his punishment would take. The kaishakunin, the second who stood behind the kneeling man with a sword ready to cut the head cleanly after the initial cut, was not a sentimental figure of compassion. He was part of a formal procedure. In many historical accounts, the actual disembowelment was abbreviated or symbolically initiated with a fan or short gesture, with the kaishakunin's cut doing the actual killing quickly. The ritual was structured to allow death to happen in a controlled way that maintained the fiction of a warrior dying by his own will, which preserved something of the social form even in punishment. The gap between the idealized version of this practice and its institutional reality matters, because what the idealized version obscures is the fact that seppuku was often not a choice at all. A senior retainer ordered to perform seppuku by his lord was being executed. The method was simply the method appropriate to his class. To refuse was to resist the lord's authority, which was itself a violation. The system was closed in a way that made genuine alternatives essentially unavailable. Not all samurai who broke rules faced these severe consequences. Survival often depended on factors that had little to do with abstract justice.
The offender's value to the lord mattered. A skilled general, a capable administrator, a man with rare expertise or strategic relationships. Such a person had something to offer that made his lord think twice before destroying him. The severity of the offense mattered, obviously, but so did the political situation at the time, the mood of the lord, the pressure from other senior retainers who might advocate for or against the offending warrior, the offender's family connections, and sometimes simply luck. Accounts from various domains across the Sengoku and Edo periods show considerable variation in how violations were handled, even for seemingly similar offenses, suggesting that the enforcement of samurai rules was always operating within a web of particular relationships and circumstances, rather than according to a purely consistent code. This is the reality that tends to get lost in popular treatments of samurai discipline. It is tempting to present the system as orderly, as philosophically coherent, as operating according to a stable set of principles that elevated these warriors above ordinary human mess. But the historical record shows something more complicated, and in some ways more human. Lords made decisions based on interest and emotion, as well as principle. Retainers who had served well for decades were sometimes protected through serious violations. Others were destroyed for offenses that might have been overlooked in different circumstances. The sword of discipline did not fall with mechanical consistency. It fell according to the logic of power. What the system of samurai punishment ultimately reveals is not the philosophical depth of warrior culture, but the practical nature of feudal authority. A lord's ability to reward and punish was the engine of his power. Without the capacity to enforce obedience, his domain would become ungovernable, his military force unreliable, his political position untenable. The elaborate ceremonies of samurai life, the careful protocols, the attention to rank and precedence, the performed deference that structured every interaction were not merely aesthetic. They were the visible surface of a system whose enforcement mechanism was real and sometimes brutal. The warrior kneeling in the firelight, which the thumbnail of this video conjures, was not simply facing an abstraction. He was facing the full weight of a system built to perpetuate itself, in which his value as a human being had always been conditional on his usefulness and his compliance. That truth is less poetic than the mythologized version. It is also considerably more honest about what feudal hierarchy actually was and how it functioned. Understanding the punishment samurai faced for breaking the rules requires setting aside the image of warriors governed by a sublime inner code and recognizing instead a class of military professionals embedded in a system of patronage and control that rewarded loyalty and punished deviation with the full practical toolkit of pre-modern power. Some of those men internalized the values of those systems deeply and genuinely. Some performed them strategically. Some broke and faced what they faced. The historical reality contains all of these people in all their variety, which is why it's worth understanding. If you want to go deeper into how the daily obligations of samurai service shaped their lives in ways that rarely appear in popular history, there's considerably more ground to cover.